She was cleaning the floor at the luxury event, but the millionaire mistook her for a celebrity, so the champagne hit the marble floor before she could do anything to stop it. The sound of the silver platter echoing through the entire grand sterling was like a gunshot in the silence of the night, and for a second that felt much longer than it was. Everything stopped. The conversations, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, everything. Chloe fell to her knees and began cleaning up the golden liquid spreading across the white floor, her fingers trembling, the rag barely obeying. Her heart was pounding. She couldn't lose this job. Not now. Not after everything that had happened in the last few months. Every penny she earned had a set purpose, and the idea of going home without a paycheck was scarier than any judgmental look in that ballroom. That's when the shadow appeared beside her. A long shadow in polished dress shoes stopped less than 3 feet away. Chloe didn't look up right away. She expected a warning or a signal for her to leave through the back door without causing more trouble, but what came was a calm, deep voice, carrying something she couldn't name at the time. "Ivy, what are you doing down there on the floor?" She raised her face slowly. In front of her stood a middle-aged man, with grey hair at the temples, broad shoulders inside an impeccable dark blue suit. He looked at her with a mixed expression, part surprise, part relief, like someone who had been searching for another person for a long time and hadn't expected to find her there, on her knees, with a rag in her hands. She opened her mouth. The wrong name hung between them for a second. Before she could speak, a woman appeared out of nowhere, elegant, brown hair pinned up and a sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. She took the man's arm with familiarity and pulled him away, saying something about an urgent meeting upstairs. And in less than 10 seconds the man had disappeared, led away by the woman as if Chloe were just another detail on the floor. But before turning the corner of the ballroom, he looked back at her over his shoulder. Chloe stayed there on her knees, rag in hand, the question spinning in her head. Who was Ivy? Mrs. Martha appeared 30 seconds later, as always happened when something went wrong. She was the head of the events team, a woman in her mid-60s with completely white hair pulled into a tight braid, dark eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that filled the space without needing much volume. She looked at the wet floor, at Chloe, at the dented platter, and gave a nod. Finish up and disappear. "Quick," she said only. No lecture, just that one word. Chloe took a deep breath and went back to work. She was 26 years old, black hair pinned in a bun, navy blue uniform with a white apron, and a red lipstick that was the only luxury she allowed herself even on the tightest days. She had been working for that events company for 3 months. It was her second job since her mother, Sarah, had fallen ill at the beginning of the year. It wasn't anything life-threatening, but it was expensive, long-term treatment, and the money drained away at a steady pace that was frightening. That's why Chloe had put aside the course she was taking at night and was holding things together as best she could. The ballroom she worked in was the most impressive one she had ever set foot in her life. White and gold flowers in enormous arrangements, tables covered in fine linen, chandeliers that looked like crystal rain. It was a private event, small guest list, very select attendees, the kind of place she would normally never step into unless she had an apron around her waist and a rag in her hand. She finished cleaning the floor and went to the kitchen to pick up another tray. That's when Ashley, a teammate, approached with wide eyes. "Chloe, do you know who the man who stopped you out there in the ballroom is?" "No." "Julian Harrington, the owner of all of this. This event is for him." Chloe felt a cold thread run down the back of her neck, so she had spilled the champagne in front of the host. "And who is Ivy?" she asked, almost without meaning to. Ashley made a startled face. "Ivy Moon, the singer. You've never heard of her? She was supposed to show up here as a surprise tonight, but she cancelled at the last minute. They say that's why Julian has been so withdrawn since the start of the evening." Chloe nodded slowly and headed back into the grand sterling with a fresh tray. But something kept nagging at her. Ivy Moon. She knew that name from somewhere she couldn't quite place, as if her memory were trying to switch on a light that hadn't reached that far yet. The night went on. The event continued. The guests drank and talked. The staff moved among them as if they were invisible. Chloe was just beginning to breathe easier when a young man in a black vest approached and said, in a low voice, that Mr. Julian would like to speak with her. She thought about telling him there must be a mistake, but the way he said it, firm and discreet, didn't sound like an invitation. It was a request that wasn't easily refused. She followed the young man to a smaller room in the back of the Grand Sterling, separated from the event by a dark wooden door. The room had walls covered in light paneling and a round table at the center. Julian Harrington was there, standing, with a glass he had barely touched. When she walked in, he looked at her and something crossed his face. A flash of confusion he quickly controlled. "Sorry for the interruption," he said, "but I needed to speak with you." "Sir, I think you're confusing me with someone else," Chloe said as directly as she could. "My name is Chloe. I'm part of the events staff." Julian was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I know who you are. I saw your badge when you were on the floor." She blinked. "But there's something interesting," he went on, tilting his head slightly. "You're practically identical to Ivy Moon. It's not just the looks. It's the way you move, the way you position yourself in a space." Chloe didn't know what to say. It was at that moment that the door opened and the elegant woman walked in. The same one who had taken Julian away earlier. Up close, she was even more imposing, with a gaze that assessed everything at all times, and a smile that always seemed to be calculating something. "Julian, we need to get back to the guests," she said. Then her eyes settled on Chloe in a way that lasted longer than necessary. "Victoria, 1 minute," Julian said. "1 minute, Julian." Victoria left without another word. But before closing the door, she cast one long look back at Chloe, the kind that needs no words to make a person uncomfortable. Julian turned back to her. "Chloe, I'll be direct. Ivy was supposed to appear here tonight for a special moment. Her presence was part of a project we're closing with some important partners. Without her, what we planned for weeks simply doesn't happen." She listened in silence. "But what interests me right now isn't that," he said, and something in his voice shifted. "What interests me is knowing where you came from." She opened her mouth, but he continued before she could speak. "I'm not being presumptuous. It's that many years ago, before any of this existed," he made a vague gesture toward the Grand Sterling and the whole building. "My father had a debt to a family, a debt that was never honored the way it should have been, and that family's surname was the same one I saw on your badge." Chloe felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. On the badge it read, "Chloe Vance." She said nothing. Inside her, something began to stir, like a piece that life had left in the wrong place for too long and was trying to make its way back to where it belonged. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, she left that room with far more questions than she had when she walked in, and that's when she bumped into Mrs. Martha in the hallway. The team leader looked at her differently this time. It wasn't the supervisor's gaze anymore. It was something else, deeper, older. "You were called in to speak with Julian," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "I was," Chloe confirmed. The two of them stood in the hallway for a second that carried the weight of so much left unsaid. Then Martha said so softly that Chloe barely heard it, "Was your grandmother's name Teresa Vance?" Chloe held her breath. Her grandmother had passed when she was very young, but the name hit her with a force she wasn't prepared to receive. "How do you know that?" Martha looked both ways down the hallway. "This isn't the place to talk, but I know things you need to know, and I should have said something before today." Before she could continue, a murmur grew out in the Grand Sterling. Voices, the sound of hurried heels, someone calling Julian's name. Martha and Chloe exchanged a glance and headed toward the noise. In the center of the Grand Sterling, among the guests who parted into two rows like a tide, stood a woman. Chloe saw her and froze where she was. It was like looking into a mirror with years added on, and a completely different life reflected back. The woman had black hair pulled into a side braid, high cheekbones, red lipstick. The posture of someone used to making space appear where there was none. The look of someone who had chosen, long ago, what she was going to leave behind. Ivy Moon had shown up after all. And she looked straight at Chloe. That lasted only a few seconds, but anyone paying attention would have noticed that Ivy's eyes were locked onto Chloe's in a way that wasn't the look of someone seeing a stranger. Julian approached Ivy with a tense smile, and the two exchanged quick words that didn't reach Chloe's ears. Victoria appeared at Julian's side, whispered something in his ear, looking at Chloe as she spoke. Julian's face turned serious. Chloe felt she needed to get out of there, grab her purse, cut through the kitchen and leave through the back door before anything else got worse. But her body wouldn't obey. Ivy approached slowly like someone measuring every step. "You work here," Ivy said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, loaded with something Chloe couldn't name. "Yes," she replied. "What's your full name?" "Chloe Vance." Ivy held her breath in a way visible enough that 2 or 3 people around them noticed, and then she said, in a voice just a little smaller than before, "Is your mother named Sarah?" I need to stop here for a second, because there are moments in a story that arrive sooner than you expect, and this was one of those moments. When I found out what comes next, I stood still for a while before I kept reading. The entire Grand Sterling could have collapsed in that moment, and Chloe wouldn't have felt it. She stared at that famous woman with the earrings worth more than 3 months of her paycheck and asked, "How do you know my mother?" Ivy looked away. It was the first time since she'd walked into the Grand Sterling that she hadn't held eye contact with anyone. "I'm her sister," Ivy said. The silence that followed was the kind that takes up physical space. Chloe knew that her mother had a sister, who had left when the 2 of them were young, a sister who changed her name, chose a new life, and never looked back. Sarah rarely spoke of it, and when she did, it was with that gentle ache of someone who had learned to carry a weight without making noise about it. The famous Ivy Moon was the aunt Chloe had never met. "You can't stay here," Ivy said, recovering some of her composure. "It'll cause problems, for both of you." "Both of us," Chloe repeated, and felt something warm rise in her throat. "You walked out of my mother's life before I was born. There is no both of us here." Ivy opened her mouth and closed it. It was Victoria who broke the silence, appearing beside the 2 of them with that smile that never reached her eyes. "What an interesting situation," she said, looking Chloe up and down. "An event employee who happens to be Ivy Moon's niece. Julian is going to love hearing every detail of this." "Victoria," Ivy said with a thread of warning in her voice. "I'm just thinking out loud," Victoria said. "All this mess could turn into a huge problem. For the event, for the project, for Ivy's image. The press loves this kind of story." Chloe looked at Victoria and understood right away that that woman wasn't on anyone's side. She was making a calculation. Mrs. Martha positioned herself between them. No rush, no drama. The way only someone who had spent decades managing difficult situations knew how to do, occupying exactly the right space without drawing too much attention. "Victoria," Martha said, with a calmness that was actually authority of a different kind. "How long have you worked for Julian?" 6 years, Victoria replied, puzzled by the question. "Then maybe you know that Julian's father, Mr. Lawrence, made an agreement with a family many years ago." Martha spoke without haste, choosing each word. "An agreement he never honored, and that Julian knows exists, but has never found the other party to settle it." Victoria's face didn't move, but her eyes went to Julian, who had come close enough to hear everything. "Martha," Julian said, "what are you saying?" The white-haired woman took a deep breath, and Chloe saw in that moment that this woman had been carrying that weight for a very, very long time. "Your father asked the Vance family for a loan when he was starting out. Teresa Vance, this girl's grandmother, lent him everything she had without hesitating because she trusted Mr. Lawrence's word. Your father never paid it back, never even tried, and the Vance family slowly lost the little they had year after year." Martha paused. "I knew about this. I was there when the agreement was made, and I never spoke up because Mr. Lawrence asked for my silence, and I obeyed. That is something I carry with me to this day. Julian stared at Martha for a long while. His expression shifted slowly, like someone piecing together a puzzle he didn't even know existed. Ivy had remained silent through all of it. When Julian finally looked at her, she said, "I didn't know any of this. I left long before that." "But you knew you had a niece," Chloe said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement that came out with a steadier voice than she herself expected. Ivy didn't deny it. "My mother wrote to you when I was born," Chloe continued. "She told me once, said she sent a letter and never got a reply." Ivy closed her eyes. "I received it." The Grand Sterling could have been empty or packed, and it wouldn't have made a difference. That moment belonged to the two of them. "I was afraid someone would find me," Ivy said, her voice lower than at any other point since she had walked in. "I had changed everything. The name, the story, everything. If I responded, someone would figure out where I came from. I thought it was easier to leave things as they were." "It was easier for you," Chloe said. "It wasn't for my mother." Ivy had no answer to that, and Chloe wasn't asking for one. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing, Julian approached Chloe with an expression she had never seen on someone who barely knew her: genuine respect. "I want to make right what my father owed," he said simply. "It won't undo what happened, but I'm not going to carry that debt." Chloe looked at him. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. "I watched you carry yourself with more dignity in a ballroom full of people judging you than most people can manage, when they've got nothing left to lose." Sarah tried to speak, but Julian cut her off with a look that needed no words. Later, as the event was winding down and the guests were leaving little by little, Chloe was collecting the trays when Ivy came back. Without the packed ballroom around her, without the weight of so many eyes, she seemed smaller. Not in a bad way, just more human. Like the armor she wore all the time had loosened just a little there. "How is she?" Ivy asked, and Chloe knew she was talking about her mother. "She's going through treatment," she said. "She's going to be fine." Ivy nodded. She stood in silence for a moment, her eyes drifting somewhere that wasn't in that ballroom. Then she pulled a card from her purse and placed it in Chloe's hand. "If she ever wants to talk to me." If she wants to. No pressure. Chloe looked at the card. She tucked it into her apron pocket, next to the cleaning cloth, without saying yes or no. When she left the event that night, the fresh air hit her face like a relief she'd been waiting for since the champagne had hit the floor. She walked slowly to the bus stop, purse on her shoulder, feet aching inside shoes that had already seen too many hours. Inside the empty bus, she stared out the windows at the city lights passing by. She thought about her mother, who was sleeping at that very moment with no idea what had happened. She thought about Martha, who had carried a secret for decades, and that night finally set it down, like someone letting go of a weight that no longer fit in a single body. She thought about Ivy, who had chosen a lifetime of distance and now, at the end of it all, was beginning to understand the price that kind of choice demands, always demands, one way or another. And she thought about Julian Harrington, who 2 days later reached out to her through the events company and made a direct offer. He wanted to sponsor the course she'd had to drop, and he was also offering her a real position in the organization of his events group, with a signed contract and room to grow. That wasn't an act of guilt or pity. It was the beginning of a settlement that should have been made a long time ago, when the debt was still new. She accepted, not without thinking it over carefully, but she accepted. Sarah learned the whole story in pieces, carefully over the course of a few days. Chloe told her gradually, watching her mother's face as the pieces came together. On the day she showed her sister's card, Sarah was silent for a long time, holding that slip of paper with both hands, as if she could weigh how much it meant. Chloe didn't push, and her mother didn't either. But 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, when the sun was streaming through the window of their tiny kitchen, Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. From her room, Chloe heard her mother's voice say, in that tone of someone who isn't sure she'll make it to the end of the sentence, "Ivy, it's me." And she closed the door slowly so her mother could have that moment all to herself. Sometimes life collects what we didn't want to pay before, and sometimes the bill arrives in the right place, at the right time, in the most unexpected way in the world. That night when Chloe was on her knees on a marble floor, cleaning up the champagne she'd spilled, she didn't know she was about to untie a knot that had bound 3 generations of her family. She just wanted to not lose her job. That was the only thought she had. And life, which is sometimes wiser than we are, used exactly that small moment, that accidental stumble, to show what needed to be seen. Life has a way of doing that, of turning the moment we most want to disappear into the moment everything starts to change. End of story. And so that's it. This story got me in a way I didn't expect when I started reading. There's something about that image of a person on their knees on the floor, looking up, that says so much about how dignity doesn't depend on where we are, but on how we carry ourselves there. Leave in the comments what you thought and where you're watching from right now. Do you think Chloe was right to accept Julian's proposal? And Sarah, do you believe she had the courage to make that call? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for keeping us company this whole time. Don't forget the like and, most important of all, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.